A secret is a wound that festers in the silence between what is said and what is meant. A betrayal committed not with a weapon, but with a word, a single altered syllable dropped into the space between two men who needed to trust each other. In the amberlit privacy of the Celestine Room, the restaurant's most coveted private dining space, where billion-dollar handshakes were finalized over lacquered black cod and aged sake, a man was being led quietly, elegantly, to his own destruction. Maya felt it the way you feel a storm before the sky ever darkens, a pressure in the chest, a wrongness in the air. She moved through the room with the practiced grace of someone who had long ago mastered the art of becoming furniture. Her hands steady as she refilled water glasses, her expression arranged into the pleasant blankness of a woman paid to be present but not noticed. She was, in every sense the room required, invisible. But invisibility had never meant blindness. Not for her. She had been a ghost for 18 months now, ever since the avalanche of her former life had buried everything she had spent a decade building. Tonight, though, something ancient and restless stirred behind her eyes. At the far end of the oval table sat Mr. Seo, a Korean industrialist whose reputation arrived in a room 10 minutes before he did. He was compact and still in the way of a coiled spring, his charcoal suit immaculate, his expression the cultivated blankness of a man who had learned early that emotion was a currency best hoarded. His hands rested flat on either side of a pale leather document folder, and Maya noticed the tendons were raised. He was not as calm as he appeared. Across from him sat two men from a Chicago-based private equity firm, ruddy-faced and leaning forward with the easy arrogance of people who had never lost. And between them all, performing the sacred duty of translation, sat a man named Derek, polished as river stone, with a jaw carved for first impressions and a voice like warm caramel poured over ice. Derek was the bridge between two languages, two cultures, two worlds. And Maya, who had spent 3 years in Seoul on behalf of a firm that no longer wanted her name attached to its letterhead, understood both sides of that bridge with a fluency no one in that room would have thought to ask about. The bridge was rotting from the inside. She caught it first on the third exchange. Mr. Seo had said something clean and unambiguous in Korean, his tone flat with the weight of a man who does not repeat himself. The exclusivity window is fixed at 90 days, and will not be extended under any circumstance. Derek had smiled at the Chicago men, tilted his head with the apologetic warmth of someone softening difficult news, and said, "Mr. Seo is open to discussing the timeline in more detail once the foundational terms are agreed upon." Maya's hand had paused, hovering over a bread plate for just a half-second, before she caught herself and moved on. Her pulse had not paused at all. It was hammering. The lie was elegant. That was what made it so devastating to witness. It wasn't crude subtraction, wasn't the blunt removal of a clause or a number. It was surgery. Derek was reaching into the living body of the negotiation and rerouting its arteries, changing the direction of blood flow, while the patient sat awake on the table and felt nothing. The Chicago men heard what they needed to hear, their shoulders dropping a fraction, their smiles loosening with relief. They believed they were making progress. They believed this man across from them, this foreign titan with the still hands and the unreadable face, was beginning to yield. They had no idea that the man across from them had not moved an inch. They had no idea they were watching a performance, and that the director was the very person they were paying to translate. Maya had known men like Derek. She had been destroyed by people who operated with exactly this kind of frictionless, consequence-free confidence. People who treated the truth as a raw material to be shaped into whatever form was most useful to them in a given moment. She had sat in a glass-walled conference room 3 years ago and watched her career be dismantled with the same precise, smiling efficiency. She recognized the technique the way a soldier recognizes the sound of a specific weapon. She retreated into the kitchen corridor under the pretense of checking the next course, her back finding the cool surface of a stainless steel prep station. The hum of refrigeration units vibrated through her shoulder blades like a second heartbeat, steadier than her own. Here, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the weight of what she knew became a physical thing. Her job was everything. It was the one-bedroom apartment she could almost afford, the payment plan on her father's medical debt, the only thread of structure left in a life that had unraveled spectacularly and publicly. She was one incident away from nothing. To intervene was to invite catastrophe. Men like Mr. Seo did not come to restaurants like this without men who waited outside in black SUVs. The Chicago firm would have lawyers on speed dial, and the kind of institutional anger that crushed individuals as a reflex. And Derek, if cornered, would not simply accept exposure. People who operated in that register never did. She had no proof beyond her own bilingual comprehension. She would sound like a delusional server with a persecution complex and a chip on her shoulder. Best case, she was fired on the spot. Worst case, she attracted the attention of people for whom a fired waitress presented no complications whatsoever. Silence was the logical choice. Silence was the mathematics of survival. But her mother's voice was in that corridor with her, as clear as it had been the morning Maya left for law school, when her mother had held her face in both hands, and said that the only thing they could not take from you was what you refused to give them. Her mother had been a translator herself, a woman who had spent decades rendering meaning across languages for people who never learned her name, and she had died still believing that words carried a moral weight, that to speak them falsely was a form of theft. She had died 2 years ago, during the worst of what happened to Maya. And Maya had not been there because she had been sitting in a deposition room having her professional life eviscerated by people who had decided she was inconvenient. Julian was stealing from Mr. Seo with every word. And Maya was the only person in the building who knew the currency of the crime. She looked at her own reflection in the dark surface of a hanging pot. A woman in a black vest and white shirt, her natural hair pinned back, her face composed. She looked like what she had agreed to become. She thought about what her mother would have said about that bargain. She already knew the answer. The plan arrived whole, the way good instincts do, without deliberation or second-guessing. She took the bottle of Krug Claus du Mesnil from the temperature-controlled case, a vintage so specific in its rarity that requesting it was its own form of theater. It gave her a reason to approach the head of the table. It gave her cover. She uncorked it with the mechanical steadiness of muscle memory, her hands operating completely independently of the cold, hammering fear in her chest, and she walked back into the Celestine room. The air inside was rich with the performance of ease, the Chicago men laughing at something Derek had said, Mr. Seo's expression accommodating a small, diplomatic smile that did not travel to his eyes. Maya moved along the perimeter of the table with the practiced invisibility of someone these men would not remember in an hour. She stopped at Mr. Seo's right shoulder. She tipped the bottle. The champagne moved in a thin, precise arc into the glass, pale gold catching the light. "A remarkable year for this house, sir," she said in clear, unhurried English, the performance of a sommelier who took her work seriously. Then she dropped her voice to the register of breath, switched to Korean with an accent she had spent 3 years earning, and said 6 words directly into the space beside his ear. "Your translator is selling you lies." She did not look at him as she straightened up. She placed the bottle on the table with a soft, final click and took 2 measured steps back. But in the single second between the words and the movement, she felt his stillness change quality. It was the stillness of a different animal now, no longer a spring coiled by patience, but something that had just been handed a specific piece of information, and was already, rapidly, processing its implications. She had seen that change. She had felt the temperature of it. She walked to the service door without hurrying. Her back was a column of exposed nerve endings. The door swung shut behind her, and she leaned against the corridor wall, and did not breathe for a very long time. The silence from the Celestine room lasted 40 seconds. She counted. Then the murmur of conversation resumed, and for a dizzying moment, she was convinced she had miscalculated entirely, that he had filed her words away as the delusion of a presumptuous server, and continued on. Her stomach turned over. The nausea was real and immediate. Then the sound changed. Mr. Seo's voice, when it came through the door, had shed its diplomatic upholstery entirely. What was underneath was something considerably harder. He said something brief in Korean. Lena recognized it as an instruction. She could not make out the words through the wood, but she recognized the shape of a command. A brief silence followed. And then Derek's voice attempted something. A reconstruction of whatever lie he had been spinning. But the cadence was wrong, the smoothness fractured. A performer who has just realized the audience knows the trick cannot fully execute it. The joints show. Then Mr. Seo spoke again, this time in English. And it was this that made Maya close her eyes. His English was not accented. It was not halting or searching. It was exact, measured, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Mr. Crawford," he said, "I would like to tell you what I have actually been saying for the past 40 minutes. What followed, filtered through 2 inches of restaurant door, was not a confrontation in the way that word usually implies violence or raised voices. It was a methodical excavation. Mr. CO walked the Chicago men through every exchange of the evening, laying his actual words beside Derek's translations the way a forensic accountant lays fraudulent entries beside the real ledger. With each line, Maya heard the Chicago men's responses shift from confusion to discomfort to a silence that had the specific texture of men reassessing everything. Derek said nothing for a very long time, and then said something that was clearly an attempt to reframe, and Mr. CO spoke over it with 4 words. "I understand you perfectly." The 2 security men who had been posted near the door were not there decoratively. The sound of movement, of a chair being pushed back, told Maya what she needed to know. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. The aftermath was organized and quiet in the way that consequences tend to be when the people administering them are professionals. The Chicago executives left through the restaurant's side corridor, their voices low, their lawyers presumably already being called. Derek left through a different exit, and did not appear to leave of his own complete volition. The Celestine room fell silent. Maya was pulling on her coat in the staff room, operating on the automatic pilot of someone running on spent adrenaline, when the floor manager appeared in the doorway and told her, in the carefully neutral voice of a man who understood that something significant had just occurred without knowing precisely what, that Mr. CO was requesting her presence. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs for 3 seconds. Then she straightened her vest, left her coat on the hook, and walked back in. Mr. CO was seated at the far end of the table alone. The leather folder was closed. A glass of water sat in front of him untouched. He looked at her with the focused assessment of a man who was very good at determining the actual value of things, and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was grateful for the table that hid the way they were shaking. "You're Korean," he said. "Is not the Korean of someone who took classes?" "No, sir," Maya said. "It isn't." He studied her for a moment. A server who speaks Korean at that level and understands the contractual implication of what she was hearing. He paused. "Tell me who you are." And there it was. The question that was not really a question but a door, and she could walk through it or she could deflect. And she looked at this man who had just been betrayed by someone he trusted and decided that she was done with deflection. Her name was Maya Osei. Until 19 months ago she had been a senior trade counsel at Halcyon Meridian Partners, specializing in cross-Pacific commercial agreements. She had been fluent in Korean before she was hired and had built 3 years of sole residency on top of that foundation. She had been 2 years from making partner. Then a senior vice president named Richard Calder had decided that a deal she was shepherding, a deal that would have significantly complicated his own parallel arrangement with a competing firm, needed to not close. And since the deal could not easily be killed, the person closing it had to be. They had accused her of sharing privileged client information with a third party. They had constructed a paper trail using internal communications that had been selectively edited and flagged by a compliance officer, who Maya later learned, had been hired specifically for this purpose. She was terminated, reported to the bar, and subjected to a professional review that cleared her of wrongdoing 18 months later, by which point the damage to her reputation had fully set. No firm would touch her. Her father's illness had consumed her savings during the review period. She had needed a job that paid weekly and did not require references from people who no longer returned her calls. "I took this job," she said, "because I needed to disappear. I was very good at it. Until tonight." Mr. CO had not moved during any of this. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked for the name of the senior vice president. She told him. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes moved in a way that made the room feel several degrees cooler. "Richard Calder," he said, "sits on the advisory board of the firm that introduced me to those men from Chicago." He said it with the flatness of someone confirming a calculation that had just resolved. Derek was not an independent contractor. He came recommended through their network. He looked at Maya with something she would later recognize as respect offered quietly, without performance. You did not simply stumble into an unrelated act of deception. You walked back into the same machinery. In the days that followed, Maya returned to her shifts and her routine and her careful invisibility, and heard nothing. The silence was its own kind of torment. She checked financial news with the compulsive attention of someone waiting for an aftershock. There was nothing. The corporate world did not leave traces of its internal corrections in places that civilians could find them. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while she was wiping down the bar, a car pulled up outside that had the specific quality of vehicles that exist to communicate that the person inside has decided something. A man in a suit that had been made for him specifically, not purchased, walked in and asked for her by her full name. He handed her an envelope, said Mr. CO had asked him to deliver it personally, and left before she had fully processed that the exchange was happening. She took it to the break room. Her hands were steady now. She had been through worse than envelopes. Inside was a dossier assembled with the thoroughness of people who had unlimited resources, and a specific directive. Internal communications from Calder's firm, time-stamped and cross-referenced. Financial transfers traced through 3 shell accounts to the compliance officer, who had filed the original report against her. Sworn statements from 2 former employees of the firm who had witnessed the construction of the case against her. Digital forensic analysis demonstrating that the documents used to implicate her had been modified after the fact, the metadata scrubbed imperfectly by someone who had been competent but not exceptional. And at the bottom, a handwritten note on paper embossed with the CO Group letterhead. An address. A time. The phrase simply, "I believe there is a more productive use of your skills." She read the dossier twice. Then she sat with it for a long time in the fluorescent quiet of the break room. What she understood, reading between the documented lines, was that she had not been a random victim of institutional self-protection. She had been targeted preemptively, because someone had assessed her as a future problem and decided to resolve the problem early. Calder's network had been doing this for years, placing adjusted translators, compromised analysts, cooperative compliance officers into the operations of competitors and targets. What had happened to her career was not an aberration. It was a methodology, and the methodology had a name, and that name now appeared in a dossier that Mr. CO's people had assembled with the evident intention of doing something consequential with it. She had not just been vindicated. She had been handed a map of the enemy's infrastructure. The following morning, she wore the charcoal suit she had kept in dry cleaning plastic for 18 months, the one she had bought for a partnership meeting that never happened. It was still a good suit. She stood in the lobby of the CO Group's regional headquarters, and felt the strange double vision of someone stepping back into a world that had once been home, and had since become mythology. The marble and the glass and the hum of institutional purpose. All of it was familiar in her body in a way that 18 months of restaurant shifts had not quite erased. Mr. CO met her in a conference room on the 32nd floor, not behind a desk. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, looking out at the city with his hands clasped behind his back. "My head of cross-Pacific negotiations retired at the end of last quarter," he said, without preamble, still looking at the city. "The division is rebuilding. I need someone to lead it. Someone with technical fluency in the relevant languages and legal frameworks." He turned. "Someone who has demonstrated, under conditions I would not have designed but must respect, that they understand the difference between a bridge and a mechanism that merely resembles one." He set a thin folder on the table between them. "This is not a debt I am repaying," he said. "I do not operate in the currency of favors. This is a calculation. You are the right person for this role. The question of whether we pursue the legal case against Calder's network is separate, and already in progress. Your testimony will be part of it if you choose. That is your decision to make for your own reasons, not a condition of this offer." Maya looked at the folder. She looked at the city through the glass. She thought about her mother holding her face in both hands, and telling her that the only thing they could not take was what she refused to give. She had given too much for too long. "My mother was a translator," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it first, except that it felt like the right beginning. She believed language was something sacred. that to use it dishonestly was a kind of desecration. She looked at Mr. Co. I went into trade law because I thought I could build something at the intersection of her belief and my skill. I was going to make agreements that held. I was going to close deals that both sides could live inside of honestly. She exhaled. And then I disappeared for 18 months and told myself I was protecting what was left of me. She pulled the folder toward her and opened it. I'd like to protect something worth protecting this time. A quiet passed between them that did not need to be filled. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Co said. 6 months later, Maya Osei stood at the head of a conference table in a building in Singapore, briefing a delegation from 3 countries on the framework of a cross-border manufacturing agreement. She had spent 11 weeks negotiating from first principles. Her Korean moved between registers with the ease of someone thinking in the language, not translating into it. Her hands rested flat on the surface of the table between points, steady as foundations. The people across from her were listening the way people listen when they understand they are in the presence of someone who will not waste their time. She had hired her own translation team for this meeting, vetted each of them personally, interviewed each of them not just for language competency, but for the specific quality her mother had called moral fluency, the understanding that words were not instruments but responsibilities. The deal closed 2 days later. Both sides signed the same agreement. Afterward, she sat alone at the window of her hotel room and looked at the harbor. The water was full of ships moving cargo between places that needed things the other places had. It was, she thought, the oldest form of negotiation. The willingness to believe that what you had was worth trading for what someone else could offer. The entire architecture of commerce rested on that belief, and the entire architecture was only as sound as the people who stood inside it, and refused to let it be used for something smaller than it was built for. She thought about 18 months in a server's uniform, and a woman who had learned to be invisible because she thought it would protect her. She thought about 6 words spoken into the ear of a man who turned out to be worth the risk. She thought about her mother, who had known all along. Some bridges are not made of steel or language or law. They are made of the decision, taken in a corridor under fluorescent light with your heart hammering and your hands steady, to tell the truth to someone who needs to hear it, even when everything you have left is on the other side of that choice. The strongest structures are the ones built by people who built them anyway. If this story moved you, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Gloria Afro-Korean Stories, hit the bell, and share this with someone who needed to hear it today. Every story we tell here is about one thing: what it costs to do the right thing, and what it gives back.